Complex topics sometimes require shorthand to quickly communicate information and one's own stance within the topic. It's extremely common, for example, within a discussion about growing concerns over the authority of the police, authority of domestic espionage, and the power of propaganda to reference George Orwell's 1984. In 1984, a totalitarian superstate has achieved supreme authority over its citizenry. The novel has become a symbol more than a story. Even those who have never read it know the basic premise enough to use it in conversation as shorthand for the complexities of a surveillance state. When referencing 1984, this is not meant to be one-to-one. Nobody is saying that America is now an exact duplicate of the hyperbolic fictional superstate Oceania. Only that saying 1984 or saying Orwellian conjures up an image and a basic idea, perhaps even a warning that if we all agree the totalitarian superstate in the novel is bad, then we should steer clear of anything that even loosely resembles its values. People misunderstand the meaning of the reference sometimes, responding, "Oh, don't be so dramatic." But this is a response to something that is not being said, or a way to dismiss the reference and prop up the surveillance state in the real world as good. Another similar exchange of symbols and shorthand, coupled with dismissals, has begun to take form, this time connected to The Handmaid's Tale, originally a novel but popularized by the critically acclaimed television series. The story is that of a totalitarian state that strips women of their rights and subjects many of them to childbearing enslavement. The show was in development for years but premiered, by happenstance, a few months after the inauguration of Donald Trump, a casually anti-choice president and an infamously anti-choice vice president gave cover to a growing erosion of reproductive rights that suddenly started to disappear at a far faster rate. Women began attending protests in handmade uniforms seen on the show as a shorthand for anyone watching the protest about their feelings on losing their hard-won constitutional rights. The Handmaid's Tale is now more valuable as a symbol than as a weekly television series. Much like references to 1984, the reference to The Handmaid's Tale is not a declaration that the fiction has sprung off the page and that women are literally enslaved. It's only shorthand in the same manner used for 1984 to conjure up an image, basic idea, and a warning that if we all agree that the society in The Handmaid's Tale is not something to aspire to, this real world and milder version is also something to avoid. But of course, when the alarm bells are rung, everyone from Twitter randos to verified journalists said not to worry too much and that referencing a television show was too sensational. But nearly every fear that women had, and indeed many men had, that the current administration would bring about terrible consequences for women and for marginalized people has come true. Everyone said calm down, and then Trump named 2 new Supreme Court justices, serving for life. Now the court was stacked with those who might overturn Roe v. Wade. Everyone said, "You're being too emotional." And then anti-choice legislators began not only testing the waters like before, but diving in head first. It doesn't matter if you think dressing up like a handmaid exaggerates the subject. That's not the point. The point is this. The fact that women are making this reference at all should tell you how serious they are, and how seriously we should all be taking this. So, how did we get here?
They said it would be temporary. Nothing changes instantaneously.
American views on abortion have a lot of gray area. It's not as simple as the pro-choice, pro-life binary one would have you believe. The circumstances in which one requests an abortion is a major sticking point for many Americans, but by and large, the vast majority of Americans believe abortion should be legal under many circumstances. Only 18% of Americans believe abortion should simply be outlawed. Gallup has been tracking American opinion on reproductive rights for a long time, and this 18% is actually down from 22% in 1976. Belief that women should have no autonomy with regards to abortion has historically had a downward trend. It is such a minority opinion that even some otherwise conservative Republicans have adopted some form of a pro-choice position. Yet, in spite of this overwhelming majority in favor of maintaining some option open, anti-abortion organizations and lobbyists continue to push the issue and present the false notion that America is roughly split down the middle. This is because sometimes polls phrase the issue as a binary, meaning questions like, would you rather call yourself pro-choice or pro-life? But even respondents who believe abortion should be legal under many circumstances sometimes identify as pro-life due to their personal beliefs, but recognize that their personal beliefs need not be the beliefs of all, particularly when said beliefs are based more in religion than anything else. Asked as a binary and as self-identification, it's about even. Asked with some level of nuance and reason, the vast majority of Americans don't believe abortion should actually be outlawed. Anti-abortion activists and lobbyists use the more misleading poll figure to make their case, of course. State legislatures have enacted new laws that have led to the shutdown of dozens of clinics throughout the United States. The old way of doing this was through trickery and obfuscation, to tell the public that anti-abortion measures were enacted to protect women, and various other lies. To skirt around Roe v. Wade, the landmark Supreme Court decision in favor of reproductive rights, they cite Planned Parenthood v. Casey, a different SCOTUS ruling that allowed individual states to place some restrictions on abortion so long as it did not outright ban the practice or create an undue burden on those seeking an abortion. However, states interpreted this the way they wanted, meaning what is undue is vague and a matter of opinion, and that laws could be created that would limit access to abortion so much that it could be nearly banned in practice, if not on paper. States like Oklahoma, Kansas, Louisiana, Utah, North Dakota, Mississippi, and more have passed laws that force abortion clinics to have admitting privileges in local hospitals. This all seems harmless at a glance until you realize that many hospitals will not grant these privileges to abortion clinics, either for political, financial, or religious reasons. The law says that your abortion clinic is fine if a hospital endorses it, but hospitals are under no obligation to endorse it, therefore forcing it to close. Lawmakers are aware of this. It's not some unintended side effect. It is the intent of the law. That's where the trickery and obfuscation comes in. Lawmakers can't outright ban abortion clinics in their state, and if they openly declare that is their intent, they lose plausible deniability should the case go to a higher court. So they create a system in which it's next to impossible for abortion clinics to meet requirements. They then claim that this is done for the safety of women, as if that were their real goal. Many other medical facilities are not subject to this requirement. It is specific for abortion clinics because lawmakers knew that hospitals might be hesitant to align themselves with the clinics. These laws might seem like political suicide for politicians considering the national numbers in favor of keeping abortion legal, at least in many cases, but national numbers are not state numbers, and national numbers are also not party numbers. In Deep Red, Mississippi, for example, the population that wants abortion illegal is higher than the national average, and the amount of Republicans who want abortion illegal is also higher than the national average. So, if you're a Republican politician in Mississippi, it may be beneficial to you to not only be anti-choice, but virulently anti-choice to secure re-election. Republican politicians can trot out these laws that shut down abortion clinics, but don't technically ban abortion on paper, to appease those in their constituency who might identify as pro-life, but believe in some exceptions such as rape, incest, or the safety of the mother. Another tactic of trickery and obfuscation comes in the form of laws that force doctors who perform abortions to give misleading information or even outright lie to their patients about the risks of an abortion. In some states, doctors are also forced to show the patient an ultrasound of the fetus, whether they want to or not. Politicians claim these measures are meant to protect women and give them the appropriate information, but since the information is false, the real intention is to either trick someone into not getting an abortion after all, or at least shaming the patient before the procedure. Another tactic of trickery comes in the form of pregnancy crisis centers, which are set up by anti-abortion groups to appear like abortion clinics. These centers give misleading advice or flat-out lie to the patients. Now, let's look at a specific case. In order to shut down abortion clinics in Texas, a law was passed that forced clinics to have the same building codes as hospitals, which almost sounds logical until you realize that the needs of clinics and hospitals are quite different and have different regulations and standards for a reason. The building housing an abortion clinic is obviously much smaller than a hospital and requires less than a hospital because the vast majority of abortions are actually non-surgical procedures. Some can even be done just with a pill. Anti-abortion lobbyists and lawmakers know all of this, but created the laws because they knew this would immediately shut down clinics that were too small, had too narrow hallways, or could not renovate their entire building to meet these unnecessary new requirements within the short deadline given. Years later, this was taken all the way to the Supreme Court. In a 5-3 decision, provisions in Texas's law were struck down as placing an undue burden, cited in the aforementioned Planned Parenthood v. Casey. This is how it used to work. State governments, activist groups, and so-called crisis centers would engage in trickery to severely limit reproductive rights while still being forced to keep abortion on the books. States would get very far, shut down various clinics, but were never able to ban abortion completely or convince the Supreme Court to side with them all the time. But that may be about to change.
They can't just do this. They can't. They can.
Every generation has had its own social and legal apparatus constructed to dehumanize women. Justifications over centuries can be found in religious faith, anxiety over the growing autonomy of women, and much more. None of these mesh together well, and none explain why, when the justifications and excuses change, the legislation remains the same. Writer and essayist Eleanor Penny once said, "Where a reason is needed for criminalizing abortions, a reason will be found." It should be noted that while the crusade against abortion in America is absolutely designed to target cisgender women, they are not the only Americans who need abortions. Trans men have a uterus and in some cases require an abortion. Their numbers are relatively small, but that does not make them insignificant. So how have attitudes changed within the past few years? The Overton window had shifted. When Trump was elected, this emboldened his most sexist and racist supporters. Arguments against their behavior were met with declarations that Trump won, and that alone was justification for their behavior. Remember, justifications for dehumanizing women change, but the result remains the same. Trump and Vice President Mike Pence are really the perfect pair for the anti-choice movement, as the former is the standard misogynist who deep down sees women being inferior as some kind of pseudoscience bio-truth, and therefore all the justification he needs to treat them as he sees fit. And the latter is a far-right Christian whose faith is all the justification he needs to treat women as vessels for procreation. Both attitudes inform the worldview of the anti-choice movement. Trump selected Neil Gorsuch for the vacant seat on the Supreme Court. This was to be filled in the previous administration, but Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell refused to do this because he has no shame. Gorsuch has shown clear signs to the Republican Party and to Trump supporters that he may oppose women's reproductive rights. In 2018, the Supreme Court voted against hearing cases to deny Medicaid funding to Planned Parenthood, but Gorsuch and other conservative justices dissented with this decision, hoping to hear the case and potentially make a ruling in favor of the states limiting access and funding to abortion. In 2019, Gorsuch sided with 3 other conservative justices in one of the aforementioned cases that required doctors performing abortions to have admitting privileges in hospitals. When Anthony Kennedy unexpectedly retired, Trump selected Brett Kavanaugh as his replacement. Kavanaugh was credibly accused of sexual assault by psychology professor Christine Blasey Ford. Such an accusation is sometimes enough to torpedo a career, but in the age of Trump, her accusation was met not only with skepticism, but accusations against her credibility in return. She was treated perhaps even worse than Anita Hill. Common accusations against women who come forward with sexual assault and rape accusations include the misogynistic cry that women only say this to become famous and for the thrill of taking down a powerful man. In reality, Christine Blasey Ford had her life upended, as she has been forced to move 4 times due to death threats and harassment. She has also had to hire security for herself for the indefinite future. Her testimony against Kavanaugh was corroborated by therapy session notes, polygraph test results, and other pieces of evidence. Kavanaugh's testimony was belligerent, hostile, insulting, and most notably of all, Trumpian. The window had shifted, and behaving like Trump was a surefire way to win over his supporters and keep oneself in the good graces of Trump himself. Before 2017, Senate rules required a supermajority to cut off debate on Supreme Court nominations. That meant that even if a president's party held the Senate, presidents generally chose nominees that would attract little controversy. However, when faced with a possible filibuster for Gorsuch due to the stolen seat, Republicans eliminated the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees. Now only a majority was needed. If Kavanaugh had been selected during any other administration, Democrats could have filibustered, and that would have been the end of him. That was no longer an option. Kavanaugh was confirmed, albeit narrowly, and that was that. Kavanaugh joined with Gorsuch and other conservative justices in the aforementioned case about abortion clinic requirements. In the past, divided party control and ideological drift among some justices made it challenging to solidify a reliably conservative Supreme Court. But with a Republican president, a Republican Senate, new rules that only required a majority to stamp out a filibuster, and with 2 seats to fill, Trump was finally able to stack the court well in the favor of his party's interests. Before Kavanaugh, Justice Kennedy, though a Republican, was considered a swing vote on some issues. That swing vote has been lost.
Fertility is a gift directly from God. He left you intact for a biblical purpose.
With some headway made during the old way of chipping at abortion rights, meaning tricks and lies, and with an anti-feminist, anti-woman, anti-choice backlash in the air, and with the Supreme Court now stacked with conservatives, the anti-abortion activists had what they wanted: a cosmic alignment of everything required to potentially overturn Roe v. Wade. But how to get it in front of the Supreme Court so that the justices revisit Roe v. Wade? The tactic appears to be to create state laws so restrictive and skirting right up to the edge of constitutionality that they will eventually make it to the Supreme Court, where a decision by the most conservative court in 50 years might overturn abortion rights. Supreme Court decisions that had their origins in local matters have a history of making sweeping changes across the country. For example, this is how marriage equality was legalized across America. With the planets aligned, anti-abortion groups and politicians are purposefully trying for the strictest laws possible, either because they know they have cover in both the Oval Office and the courts, or because they are hoping to make an even bigger splash that will effectively overturn Roe v. Wade. Here are some examples of these new restrictive laws. An Alabama law has made performing an abortion a felony. The only exception is when the life of the mother is endangered by the pregnancy. Georgia's heartbeat law bans abortions as early as 6 weeks into pregnancy, often before someone knows they are pregnant. And even if they do learn shortly before the deadline, they have little time to prepare and even find an abortion clinic that's still open in the Deep South. Kentucky, Mississippi, Ohio, and Missouri have passed similar laws, albeit with different language and deadlines. Louisiana and South Carolina are both trying for the same as of this writing, and Alaska may go even further with a ban that has no exceptions whatsoever. The Supreme Court might hear one of these cases, or perhaps an earlier case, June Medical v. Gee, that has been making its way through the system. This could happen as early as June 2020. Even if some of the Supreme Court's Republicans would prefer to put off this question until after the election a few months later, anti-abortion state lawmakers and lower court judges are forcing their hands. Many of the lawmakers behind the most extreme laws in Georgia and Alabama have been explicit that the whole purpose of their new laws is to make the Supreme Court take up one of them and subsequently overrule Roe v. Wade. The old way of eroding reproductive rights was tricks and lies. The new way, now that the deck is stacked in their favor, is to push the boundaries so far that the Supreme Court has no choice but to take a look and potentially overturn almost half a century of legal rights. The Supreme Court knows it's coming. It's why Justice Thomas recently wheeled out the old and tired argument that abortion is eugenics because one of the Planned Parenthood founders admittedly had just the worst take sometimes. He knows it's coming and he's priming the pump. People are understandably angry and worried. They are protesting in the streets, they are wearing handmade outfits to make a point, and they are doing whatever they can to sway public opinion enough to either convince the states to reverse course or to convince the justices to preserve their rights should the case come before them. America doesn't have to become an exact duplicate of the fictional country in The Handmaid's Tale for it to be a more dangerous place. We won't see a second civil war. We won't need to. All it will take is a few men who have proven not to be friends to women in this country. Former Justice Kennedy's record on reproductive rights was mixed at best, but there is every indication that his replacement, Brett Kavanaugh, is a hardline conservative. Trump had long vowed to appoint justices who would reverse Roe. At the risk of being morbid, things could get even worse if, say, 86-year-old Ruth Bader Ginsburg doesn't live through this president's administration. There would be no stopping Trump from selecting another anti-abortion conservative to replace her due to the new Senate rules. We'll have to wait to see what happens next year, both in terms of what cases the court takes on and how the general election shakes out. Even if reproductive rights are somehow enshrined and protected once again by a surprise swing vote by Chief Justice Roberts or someone, the cracks in the window of public discourse among politicians may have been damaged beyond repair. And finally, for everyone who said not to worry and that people were being too dramatic, you were wrong. Even if Roe is not overturned, the new laws are extremely restrictive all on their own. You were wrong. Don't tone police women on their protests. They have reason to be concerned.